Unlike the Serbian Mihailovic, Tito was born a Croat. After a distinguished military career, he turned to politics. Tito spent many years in Moscow, where in 1937 Stalin appointed him Secretary General of the Yugoslav Communist Party. After the German invasion, Tito was instructed by Moscow to do his bit for the defense of the Soviet motherland by harassing the Germans in Yugoslavia. Mihailovic began raising his guerrilla army to fight the Germans so that the king could one day reclaim his country. He recruited his guerrillas almost exclusively from royalist Serbia. Many of their fathers had fought in the First World War. Among them were the Chetniks, who had perfected the art of guerrilla warfare over 400 years of Turkish occupation. Mihailovic's men adopted their name. There were now 2 anti-German guerrilla forces in Yugoslavia. The problem for the British was which of these 2 forces should they support. The natural choice for Churchill and his war cabinet was to back Mihailovic. He was a royalist and he hated communism like Churchill. But soon the situation would become even more confusing. Royalist Chetniks began fighting the communist partisans. A full-scale civil war erupted. Thousands were slaughtered. In fact, more Yugoslavs would be killed by Yugoslavs than by Germans during the war. That winter, the Germans took ground from both sides, easily. News of the conflict reached London, where the Yugoslav government in exile begged the British to help Mihailovic. And at first that seemed the most likely outcome. Then 2 pieces of information changed everything. British intelligence headquarters for the Balkans was based here in Cairo, Egypt, where Colonel Cleveland Keble had been studying the efforts of Mihailovic's Chetniks. When Churchill came to Cairo to meet other world leaders in January 1943, Keble briefed him on the situation. He told him that he had evidence that Mihailovic was ineffective in fighting the Germans, and perhaps Tito might be a better bet. So Churchill made a momentous decision. He would ditch Mihailovic and back Tito.
It was on the strength of these reports that the British government decided to give all-out help to the partisans, something, by the way, that they certainly were not getting from the Russians.
Fitzroy Maclean was perhaps the least likely person to ask to make a deal with a communist. In fact, he hated them. Maclean arrived in Russia at the height of Stalin's murderous Great Purges. Under Stalin's orders, thousands of senior Communist Party members were executed. They included Lenin's close friend and founding member of the party, Nikolai Bukharin. It left him disgusted and sealed his lifelong loathing for communism. Then Stalin did something that terrified him.
The lights began to burn all night in Moscow. And on August 21st, 1939, the world was set on its heels by the announcement of a treaty between the Russians and the Germans in which they agreed not to fight each other. Here were the admitted arch-enemies in a state of apparent friendship. It was too fantastic to make any sense. It didn't.
The shock deal signed by these 2 sworn enemies was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Maclean was convinced that world peace was in jeopardy. He later wrote, "It seemed to me that by linking 2 of the most blood-soaked regimes in history, war was now inevitable. He was right, because the pact had more serious implications than even he had imagined. Fitzroy Maclean raced back to London desperate to join up. Met, Churchill was unequivocal about Maclean's mission: to find out who Tito was and win his trust.
I said, what is the purpose of my mission? And he said, well, first and foremost, it's military, to find out quite simply who is killing the most Germans and how we can help them to kill more. And I said, what about the political implications? These people are communists. And he said they are secondary.
The next day, Fitzroy Maclean parachuted into Yugoslavia. With him was a hand-picked team of 11 engineers, sappers, soldiers, and intelligence officers. The drop went perfectly, and Maclean's team landed in the middle of partisan country.
Tito in those days was a shadowy figure as far as the outside world was concerned. Some people said he was a committee, others a handsome young woman, others that he didn't exist at all.
Maclean's task was to find out if Tito and his men would join the Allies and fight the Germans. He sent a series of messages to the Prime Minister to detail his progress. They showed from the beginning that Tito was a man Maclean could do business with.
As a personality, I found Tito much easier to get on with than most communists I'd met in Russia and elsewhere. He made no secret of being a communist. On the contrary, he gloried in it.
Maclean also reported to London that by his estimates, Tito's partisans now numbered almost 250,000. Easily the biggest potential force of resistance in Europe. The question was, could they fight? On the 1st of December 1943, Allied leaders Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill met for the first time in Tehran. High on the agenda was the situation in Yugoslavia. The so-called Big Three pledged to give all possible help to the partisans. 9 days later, Churchill flew to Cairo from the Tehran conference. Fitzroy Maclean was waiting for him. Churchill told him of the decision taken in Tehran to step up the support for Tito. But Maclean voiced concerns.
I said that I had no doubt that the partisans would take power once the war was over and would set up a communist regime. At that point, Winston interrupted me and said, do you intend to make Yugoslavia your home after the war? Do you intend to live there? And I said, no. And he said, well, neither do I, and therefore had we not better leave it to the Yugoslavs to work out what kind of regime they want?
Maclean returned to Yugoslavia with a clear mission: to rearm and motivate the partisans and drive the Germans out of the country. This time, Churchill's son, Randolph, was on the mission. Maclean told the partisans to prepare safe landing strips because the Allies were on their way.
Here at a secret airport, American and British forces are cooperating with Yugoslav guerrillas to maintain this efficient and vital supply line.
The partisans had no idea how much equipment they were about to get. In just 2 nights, they received as much as Mihailovich had in 2 years. Within just a few weeks, British and American planes had delivered or dropped 100,000 rifles, 50,000 machine guns, 1,380 mortars, over 600,000 grenades, almost 100 million rounds of ammunition, 700 radio sets, and 250,000 pairs of boots. But one person who was not pleased by this was Colonel Draza Mihailović. So the royalist Serbian guerrilla leader, still hiding out in the mountains with his Chetniks, tried to win back British favor. His territory straddled a key German supply line, the railway to Greece. He ordered his men to destroy a bridge on that line. A British agent was with him and took these pictures as it was blown up. But the operation backfired when the credit was given to Tito's partisans. The order was given that all British contact with the Chetniks must cease. British foreign policy had turned full circle. For Mihailović and his Chetniks, the decision was a catastrophe. Abandoned by the Allies, thousands of them changed sides and joined the Nazis. Churchill had further justification for dropping Mihailović. Now the operation entered a new phase. By the spring of 1944, this military exercise changed from one of supply and support to full-scale Allied collaboration. The Yugoslavs were given their own air force. The RAF Balkan Air Force was made up of 15 types of Allied aircraft, including these Spitfires. Air superiority had the power to make a huge difference to the war. The man who was put in charge of all bomber and fighter operations was Fitzroy MacLean. Not only could he now coordinate all future supply drops to the partisans, but he could also plan to attack strategic targets from the air. He would later say the Air Force gave him an incalculable advantage in obtaining quick results. MacLean's Air Force would swing the battle comprehensively in favor of the partisans. After the Air Force came the ground troops. British and American commandos were dropped into the country to train and fight with the partisans once the war was won. So Churchill decided that he should meet Tito. He reached Fitzroy MacLean, who was with Tito at a new partisan base on the small Dalmatian island of Vis. From here, he and Tito flew to the liberated Italian city of Naples to meet Churchill. The royalist Yugoslav government in exile and many other senior Allied commanders also traveled for the conference. On the 17th of June, they seemed to reach a deal. Once Yugoslavia was free, Tito agreed to somehow work with the government in exile. He even agreed that King Peter could retain his crown. The only question was, would Tito keep his word? With liberation on the horizon, Fitzroy MacLean wanted the partisans to attack the Germans as they withdrew. The railway line near Leskovac in Serbia was the first target. Leaving Tito in his headquarters, MacLean assembled a force of men and led them on a march to the town. Fitzroy MacLean and his men marched on, looking for new targets. But a messenger caught up with them. He brought strange news. Tito had gone missing from Vis. MacLean raced back to Vis to investigate and discovered something disturbing. An unidentified aircraft had landed at Vis and taken off again with Tito on board. Where on earth had he gone? MacLean thought that Tito had traveled inland to coordinate the final battle for Belgrade. A week after the liberation of Belgrade, MacLean found Tito in a villa on its outskirts. Tito revealed that he hadn't been in Belgrade after all. He'd been to Moscow, where he'd received instructions direct from Stalin. Tito now made his move. He reneged on the deal he made in Naples and announced that he would be Yugoslav leader, and there was to be no place for the king or his government. It seemed that Yugoslavia would be turned into the communist state that Maclean had feared.